You may be seated. Today is All Saints Sunday, and this morning I want to talk about saints. Not only the ones we call and know by name, like Saint with a capital S, Saint Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, etc., but all the faithful, nameless Christians who over and over again in the New Testament are called saints with a little s. So in order to talk about these saints, we're going to have to do a little time travel back to a time and a trip that I took with my parents in 1960. Now, when I was a child growing up here in Fountain City, school started sometime after Labor Day, and the date varied from year to year. So my family usually took a late summer vacation, usually to the Miami area, to Key Biscayne, which is just south of downtown Miami. It's a barrier island connected to the mainland by the Rickenbacker Causeway. Today, it's the crowded home of millionaires and billionaires and gazillionaires with their huge, huge homes. But when I was growing up, it was nothing like that. At that time, there was little development on the island. Its main claim to fame was a small Crandon Park Zoo. Key Biscayne at that time only had a few streets. There was the main street that came in off the causeway, and then a couple of other little streets with very modest cement block homes that had been built as affordable housing for World War II vets. There were exactly 2 restaurants on the whole island. One was a Howard Johnson's, which I loved because they had peppermint ice cream. And the other was a Tudor-looking place called the English Pub that was a bit more upscale. They even served steak. There was also a small shopping strip with an independent grocery store, a drugstore, and a sort of a hardware variety store that contained a whole lot of different items. For many years on Key Biscayne, there had been only one hotel on the beach and one motel where we usually stayed that was on sort of the main road that came in. But in September of 1960, my mom and dad and I stayed in a small wooden cottage at the newly opened Key Colony Resort. Our cottage was built up on stilts and was technically on the beach, but it was near but not inside of the ocean. You had to walk a ways to get to the water. And that September, we were having just the greatest time. We were having so much fun. The weather was perfect. The water was beautiful. It was just fantastic. But unknown to us, as was it's often the case that time of year in September, a tropical depression rolled off the coast of Africa and headed out to sea. And as it crossed the waters of the Atlantic, it grew into a major hurricane and headed straight for Miami. When we finally got the news, my mother was absolutely, I remember, panicked, just absolutely terrified. Especially when my dad made the decision that we weren't going to try to evacuate, but we were going to stay right where we were. Now, my dad was not a foolish man. He was adventurous, but not foolish. You have to realize that back then, weather notifications came much, much later than they do now. Storms were nearly upon you before they knew that they were there or where they were going. So we didn't get the news until very late. There were no satellites tracking those storms every minute. In Florida, believe it or not, and I have a hard time believing it, and I saw it, was not so developed or populated as it is today. Central Florida, was just nothing. It had a bunch of little towns connected by a narrow two-lane road surrounded by just a lot of scrubby plants and a lot of nothing else. Walt Disney World in Orlando, they didn't exist. Orlando was just a wide place in the road. And Walt Disney World wouldn't be finished until 1971. More importantly, there was no interstate. I really am old, aren't I? There was no I-95 that could whisk you to the north and away from danger. That interstate didn't start to be built in sections until the 1960s, and it wasn't completed until the 1980s. So the only way to go inland was into the Everglades on the Tamiami Trail. And the idea of being out there and possibly stranded and the house guest of a lot of big alligators didn't thrill my dad. And my mom either once she thought about it. So we decided there was nothing we could do. We were in many ways like the people of Jamaica last week when you had no place to go. So to get ready as much as we could, we headed over to that little strip mall and gathered up supplies. Things like flashlights, batteries, candles, water, non-perishable food items, bread, peanut butter and jelly, chips, crackers, that sort of stuff. And this was early in the morning, and the stores opened early so you could get your supplies. And then we headed back to the cottage to wait. Later that afternoon, we watched out our windows as Hurricane Donna approached. Donna was one of the worst hurricanes to ever hit the east coast of Florida. She's still in the record books. You can look her up. She was a Cat 4, bordering on a Category 5 at times, and she surged to that off and on. She was not as powerful as Melissa by any means, but she was very destructive and dangerous. And what a storm she was. Now, I loved it because I was a kid, and I thought, this is just a great storm. Didn't realize we could die in this. So I was fascinated by it. And remember, I said we were staying near, but not inside of the ocean. As the winds grew stronger and stronger and stronger, the waves got bigger and bigger and bigger until they were clearly visible outside through our window in the front of the living room. In front of the cottage and all the way to the beach, there were these absolutely gorgeous royal palm trees. And when the full, excuse me, my voice this morning is not the best. The full brunt of the storm was upon us. I watched in amazement as the winds and those great walls of water hit those palm trees with tremendous force. Some of those palms were nearly 70 feet tall, and yet their tops would bend over a bit, and they would shake this way and that, and palm fronds would go flying in all directions. And the wind would ease off a little bit, and they'd try to stand back up only to be hit again by another blast of wind and water. And that drama went on for hours until the eye of the hurricane went through and it got really quiet, just about dark. And then a while later, the whole thing began again, but didn't seem to be as strong as the rest of the disturbance went through. The next day, the next morning, quite early, we got up and decided to walk through the grounds and survey the damage that had taken place. There were coconut palms that were mixed among those royal palms, because once that in the south end of Key Biscayne had been a coconut plantation. And a good many of those coconut palms had not survived the storm because their root system spread out shallowly along the top of the sand. And so when it got really, really wet, their roots gave way and they collapsed like giants into the earth. But most of the royal palms, they had survived, because their root systems, instead of going out, went down and held them firm. And their trunks remained flexible and bent as the winds and the waters hit them again and again and again. Now I have to tell you, they looked pretty awful. All their palm fronds on most of them were gone, and they were just sort of a trunk sticking up into the sky. And their trunks itself were torn and gouged from the sand and debris that had hit them again and again. But a few years later, they'd be standing really tall, all their palm fronds grown back, basking in the sun, like the giants that they were. Well, saints to me are like royal palms. In fact, the scriptures even calls them a royal priesthood. They're not aloof, pious folk who remain untouched by the world. They've had storms in their lives, times when the skies have grown dark with sadness and fear, and waves of grief and pain, anger and regret, failure and loss have crashed in upon their world, often with little warning. Some saints have been bent over, almost to the point of breaking by the winds of change, disappointment, or isolation. They've also, at times, almost been uprooted and nearly swept away by feelings of guilt or hopelessness or depression, or by physical, emotional, mental pain and illness. They've been hit again and again by the full force of the worst that life has to offer. But they've stood, not in their own strength, but in the strength of God. Saints are not perfect. They carry with them the scars of all they have suffered, and they also bear the mark of their own imperfections. Here and there's a display a nod of impatience, a bump of laziness, a scratch of conceit, and many other things like that. Who are these imperfect, battered saints? You and me, and everyone who has truly ever embraced the name and call of Christ. Remember, I told you that in the New Testament, often Christians are called saints with a little s. And today, in the next service at 11 o'clock, we're going to baptize into that community of saints 3 new members, Harper, Zane, and Zoe. Together with them, we are the saints of God, as well as all the faithful who have gone before us, that great cloud of witnesses. In today's gospel lesson from Luke that Father Rick read, Jesus spoke of the actions of those who will be blessed, who will be saintly, and those who will fall short of the mark. He also gives saints a recipe for living in these words: love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, and simply do to others as you would have them do to you. Learning this lesson and others that Jesus taught us will help us send our faith roots deep, because the storms of life, they do come. The rains fall on the just and the unjust, and they will hit us with their unbridled fury sometimes, shaking us this way and that. We saints of God don't get a pass on the troubles and struggles and storms of life. I wish we did. And thus we live rooted with Jesus Christ, keep our faith roots deep in him, and become strong in our faith, then we can risk being uprooted like those coconut palms when we're hit with the full force of life's trials and afflictions. But if we stay rooted in Jesus Christ, then no matter what happens, how many times we are bent and shaken, we will not be uprooted. That's God's promise, and that's our hope and prayer on this All Saints Sunday. May it be so for all of us. And God's people said, Amen.